A blood pact that couldn't be undone. Juliana De Luca had spent her life running from the world her father ruled, but when he was assassinated, she was dragged back into a game she never wanted to play. The only way to survive was to marry him, Salvatore Costa, the most feared Don in Naples. He slid a ring onto her finger, his voice cold. "You don't have to love me," he murmured. "You just have to obey." Chapter 1. The Serpent's Shadow returns. The insistent ringing of the telephone sliced through the quiet hum of Juliana De Luca's London flat, a jarring intrusion into the carefully constructed sanctuary she'd built for herself. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the turmoil that instantly churned in her gut. She knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach, that the life she'd fled 15 years ago had finally caught up with her. She let it ring, her gaze fixed on the framed photograph on her bookshelf, a younger, carefree version of herself, arm in arm with her father, Don Alessandro De Luca, on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the Bay of Naples. The smile on her face in the picture felt like a betrayal now, a relic of a life she'd deliberately buried. The ringing stopped, only to be replaced by a sharp, insistent knock on the door. Juliana didn't move. She knew who it was, even before the muffled voice, thick with a Neapolitan accent she hadn't heard in years, reached her ears. "Signorina De Luca? It's Marco. Marco Bellini. Your father. He would want you to open." Her father. The words sent a shiver down her spine, a complex cocktail of grief, resentment, and a terrifying sense of inevitability.
Alessandro De Luca.
The name alone conjured images of power, fear, and a world of shadows she desperately tried to escape. A world of omerta, of blood oaths and whispered threats, of lavish feasts followed by brutal violence. She finally moved, her legs heavy, each step echoing the reluctant beat of her heart. She opened the door a crack, the chains still firmly in place. Marco Bellini stood there, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. He was older, his once jet-black hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes held the same unwavering loyalty she remembered. He'd been her father's consigliere, his most trusted advisor, and now he was the bearer of news she knew would shatter her carefully constructed world. "Marco," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Signorina," he replied, his voice heavy with a grief that mirrored her own, though she dared not show it. "It's your father, he's gone."
Gone.
The word hung in the air, stark and unforgiving. Not dead, not murdered, just gone. The euphemism was a chilling reminder of the world she'd left behind, a world where death was rarely spoken of directly, but always present, a silent guest at every gathering.
How?
She asked, the question a mere formality. She knew the answer. In their world, there was only one way a Don like Alessandro De Luca departed. Marco's gaze didn't waver. A meeting. Ambushed. There were no survivors. Juliana closed her eyes, the image of her father, not as the powerful Don, but as the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had read her bedtime stories, flashing before her. The memories were bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge of his other life, the life she had rejected. He asked for you, Signorina, Marco continued, his voice softening. In his last moments he spoke your name. A lie, perhaps. A comforting fiction designed to ease her guilt, to draw her back into the fold. But even if it was a lie, it worked. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. What am I supposed to do? She asked, the question a plea for guidance, for an escape she knew didn't exist. Marco's expression hardened. You are the Arid Signorina.
The heir.
You are the only one who can maintain order. The family, they need you. The family. Another euphemism. This one for the sprawling network of criminals, soldiers, and informants that her father had controlled. The family that had demanded her obedience, her silence, her very soul. I left that life behind, Marco, she said, her voice gaining a flicker of defiance. I made a new life for myself here. A life of peace. Peace? Marco's voice was laced with a subtle hint of scorn. There is no peace for a De Luca, Signorina. Not while our enemies circle like vultures. Your father built an empire. It is your duty to protect it.
Duty.
Another word that held no meaning for her, not in this context. She'd spent 15 years building a career as a respected art historian, specializing in Renaissance masters. Her world was one of beauty, of creativity, of light. This was a descent back into darkness. And if I refuse? She asked, knowing the answer even as the words left her lips. Marco's gaze was unwavering. There will be chaos, Signorina. A bloodbath. The other families, they will see weakness. They will take what is rightfully yours. And they will not spare anyone who carries the DeLuca name. He didn't need to elaborate. She understood the brutal logic of their world. Weakness invited aggression. Hesitation was fatal. Her refusal wouldn't just endanger her, it would unleash a war that would consume everything her father had built, and everyone who had ever been loyal to him. She looked around her flat, at the shelves filled with books, the paintings on the walls, the small, unassuming life she had created. It was a fragile haven, built on the sands of denial. And now, the tide was coming in. There is another matter, Marco said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Your father, he arranged a marriage. Juliana felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. A marriage? Of course. In their world, alliances were forged through blood and matrimony. It was the ultimate insurance policy, a guarantee of loyalty. To whom? She asked, her voice trembling. Marco hesitated for a moment, as if reluctant to speak the name.
Salvatore Costa.
The name hit her like a physical blow.
Salvatore Costa.
The Capo dei Capi, the boss of all bosses, of the Neapolitan Camorra. A man known for his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his chillingly cold demeanor. A man who inspired fear even in the most hardened criminals. A man she had met only once, years ago, at a family gathering, a fleeting encounter that had left her with a lingering sense of unease, of being observed by a predator. It was a strategic alliance, Marco continued, his voice carefully neutral. To solidify the families. To ensure stability. Stability. Another euphemism, this one for absolute control. Her father had sold her, bartered her away like a piece of property, to secure his legacy. And now, she was expected to honor that agreement, to walk willingly into the lion's den. She closed her eyes, the weight of her inheritance pressing down on her, crushing her. She was trapped. There was no escape. The life she had so carefully constructed was crumbling around her, and she was being dragged back into the world she had sworn to leave behind. The serpent's shadow had returned. She felt for the small, silver cross she always wore, hidden beneath her blouse, a silent prayer escaping her lips. She looked back at Marco, her voice barely a whisper, tinged with a newfound, desperate resolve. When do we leave? Chapter 2. Whispers of a Fallen Empire. The private jet sliced through the turbulent night sky, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within Juliana. Below, the lights of London faded into the distance, replaced by the vast, inky blackness of the sea. She sat by the window, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed on the darkness, a woman caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Marco sat across from her, his silence more oppressive than any conversation. He'd been the same since they left her flat, his demeanor a mixture of somber respect and unspoken expectation. He was the executor of her father's will, both literally and figuratively, and she knew he would not deviate from his duty, no matter the cost. She glanced at the folder he'd given her, a thick dossier filled with information about Salvatore Costa, the Costa family, and the current state of the Neapolitan underworld. She hadn't opened it. She didn't need to read the details to know the danger she was facing. She could feel it in the tense set of Marco's shoulders, in the hushed whispers of the crew, in the very air she breathed. He will be expecting you, Marco said, his voice breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on hers. Expecting me? Juliana replied, a hint of bitterness in her tone. Or expecting the fulfillment of a contract. A transaction completed? Marco's expression remained unchanged. He is a man of tradition, Signorina. He will honor the agreement your father made. And what about my honor, Marco? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about my choice?" He looked at her, his gaze softening slightly, a flicker of something akin to sympathy crossing his face. "Your choice was made for you, Signorina. The moment you were born a DeLuca." His words were a cold reminder of the reality she was facing. She was not Juliana, the art historian, the woman who had carved out a life of her own. She was Juliana DeLuca, daughter of the fallen Dawn, a pawn in a game she had never wanted to play. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure an image of Salvatore Costa, of the brief encounter she'd had with him years ago. She remembered his eyes, dark and intense, that seemed to see through her, to strip away her defenses. She remembered the way he moved, with a quiet confidence, a controlled power that radiated from him like heat. She remembered the feeling of unease, of being in the presence of something dangerous, something untamed. The memory sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. She knew he was not a man to be trifled with, a man who would not hesitate to crush anyone who stood in his way. And yet, there was something else there, something she couldn't quite define, a hint of vulnerability, perhaps, or a loneliness that mirrored her own. The jet began its descent, the lights of Naples shimmering below, a glittering tapestry of beauty and danger. She looked out at the city, at the familiar silhouette of Mount Vesuvius looming in the distance, a constant reminder of the volatile forces that lay beneath the surface, both natural and human. She had spent her childhood here, in this city of contradictions, of vibrant life and sudden death, of ancient history and modern-day crime. She had loved it, and she had hated it. And now, she was returning to it, not as a visitor, but as a prisoner of her own heritage. The jet landed smoothly, and the doors opened, revealing a small, discreet entourage waiting on the tarmac. Marco stepped out first, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his hand instinctively moving towards the inside of his jacket, where she knew he carried a weapon. She followed him, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, of exhaust fumes, and something else, something indefinable, a scent of power and danger. A black car, sleek and imposing, pulled up beside them. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his face impassive, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He was dressed in a tailored suit, impeccably dressed, but there was something about him, a hardness, a ruthlessness, that spoke of the world he inhabited. "Signorina DeLuca," he said, his voice deep and resonant, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her, weighing her. "Welcome back to Naples." It wasn't a welcome, it was a statement of fact. A declaration of ownership. She was back. And she was his. She met his gaze, refusing to show any sign of fear, though her insides were churning. She lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. The familiar scent of jasmine and something darker, something like gunpowder and old secrets, filled the air, originating from the manicured gardens surrounding the airstrip. A faint, almost imperceptible sound of distant church bells reached her ears, a stark contrast to the tension coiled tight in her chest. This was not a homecoming, it was a surrender. But perhaps, within that surrender, she could find a way to survive. Perhaps she could even find a way to fight. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unwanted Crowns. The drive to the Costa estate was a blur of narrow, winding streets, bustling markets, and ancient buildings that seemed to lean in towards each other, whispering secrets of centuries past. Juliana sat in the back of the car, silent and watchful, her gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. She recognized some of the landmarks, remnants of her childhood, but they felt foreign now, viewed through the lens of her new, unwanted reality. The car finally pulled through a set of imposing wrought iron gates, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with cypress trees. At the end of the drive stood the Costa mansion, a sprawling, centuries-old villa that exuded an aura of power and history. It was a beautiful building, with its ochre-colored walls, its terracotta roof tiles, and its lush gardens, but it felt more like a prison than a home. As the car came to a stop, The same man who had greeted her at the airport opened the door, his expression unchanged. "Senior Salvatore is waiting for you in the study," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. Juliana stepped out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She followed the man through a grand entrance hall, adorned with marble floors, frescoed ceilings, and antique furniture. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something else, a faint trace of cigar smoke, a signature of the man she was about to meet. They reached a pair of heavy wooden doors, intricately carved with scenes of mythical battles. The man knocked once, then opened the door, revealing a large, dimly lit study. The room was lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes. A large, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, and behind it, silhouetted against the light from a single window, stood Salvatore Costa. He turned as she entered, and Juliana felt her breath catch in her throat. He was even more imposing than she remembered, taller, broader, his presence filling the room. He was dressed in a dark suit, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of a gold chain. His hair was dark and thick, brushed back from his forehead, and his eyes, those intense, dark eyes, were fixed on her, studying her with an unnerving intensity. "Juliana," he said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze unwavering. "You have arrived." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a confirmation of her surrender. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I had little choice," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or respect crossed his face. He gestured towards a chair in front of the desk.
"Sit down."
She walked towards the chair, her movements deliberate, her head held high. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was determined to show him that she was not afraid, that she was not a broken woman, despite the circumstances. He remained standing, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail. "You resemble your father," he said, his voice thoughtful. "So I've been told," she replied, her voice neutral. He walked around the desk and sat down, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator settling into its lair. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes never leaving hers. "He spoke of you often," he said.
"He was proud of you." "Proud?"
Juliana doubted that. Her father had been disappointed in her refusal to embrace the family business, in her decision to leave Naples and pursue a life of her own. He had seen her as a failure, a weakness in the family line. He had a strange way of showing it, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. Salvatore's expression remained unchanged.
"He was a man of his time," he said.
A man of tradition. He believed in certain ways of doing things. "And those ways included marrying me off to a man I barely know?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "It was a strategic alliance," he said. "A necessary one." "Necessary for whom?" she challenged. "For you? For the families?"
"Certainly not for me."
A faint smile played on his lips.
"You are direct," he said.
"I admire that." "I am not here to be admired, Signor Costa," she replied. "I am here because I was forced to be here. Because my father, in his infinite wisdom, decided to use me as a bargaining chip in his power games." He leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. "And you believe you have no power of your own?" he asked, his voice low and challenging. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What power could I possibly have?"
she asked.
"I am a woman alone, in a world ruled by men, by violence, by you." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You underestimate yourself, Juliana," he said. "You are a DeLuca. You have the blood of a Don running through your veins. And that is a power in itself." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "You may not have chosen this life," he continued.
"But you are here now.
And you have a choice to make. You can either be a victim, a pawn in this game, or you can be a queen." A queen. The word echoed in her mind, a title both terrifying and alluring. She looked at him, at this man who held her fate in his hands, this man who was both her captor and, potentially, her protector. She saw the power in his eyes, the ruthlessness, but she also saw something else, something that intrigued her, something that challenged her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that she was not as powerless as she thought. She had her intelligence, her resilience, her knowledge of a world he knew nothing about. She had the blood of her father, yes, but she also had her own strength, her own will. And she would use it. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn. She would find a way to navigate this world, to survive and perhaps even to thrive. The weight of the unwanted crown felt heavy, suffocating, but beneath it, a spark of defiance ignited. She straightened her shoulders, a subtle shift, but one that spoke volumes. "And what if I choose to be neither?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. His dark eyes held hers, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a smile that promised both danger and something infinitely more complex. He was a predator, yes, but she was beginning to suspect she was not entirely prey. Not anymore. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Empty Palace. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Juliana was given the run of the mansion, a gilded cage filled with priceless art, antique furniture, and the ghosts of generations past. She wandered through the vast, echoing rooms, feeling like an intruder in her own ancestral home. The staff treated her with a mixture of deference and suspicion, their eyes always watching, their whispers following her like shadows. She spent hours in the library, surrounded by the scent of old books and leather, losing herself in the pages of history, trying to escape the reality of her present. She discovered hidden passages, secret rooms, and forgotten corners of the mansion, each discovery a small act of rebellion, a way of claiming this space as her own. She rarely saw Salvatore. He was a constant presence, a shadow lurking in the periphery of her life, but he remained elusive, a phantom emperor ruling his kingdom from the shadows. When they did meet, it was always brief, formal, their conversations circling around the edges of the unspoken tension that simmered between them. He had given her a room that overlooked the gardens, a sprawling vista of manicured lawns, fountains, and ancient statues. It was a beautiful room, filled with sunlight and the scent of flowers, but it felt like a prison cell. She would often stand at the window, gazing out at the city below, at the distant silhouette of Mount Vesuvius, longing for the freedom she had lost. One evening, as she was standing at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, she heard a knock on the door. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, knowing who it was before she even saw him. Salvatore entered the room, his presence instantly filling the space, his dark eyes fixed on hers. He was dressed in a casual shirt and trousers, his usual formality replaced by a relaxed ease that made him seem even more dangerous. "You spend a lot of time here," he said, his voice low and resonant, his gaze sweeping over the room, then settling back on her. "It's peaceful," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He walked towards the window, standing beside her, their bodies close but not touching. He looked out at the view, at the city bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Naples is beautiful," he said, his voice thoughtful, "but it can also be cruel." "I know," she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you regret coming back?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Did she regret it? Yes, she regretted the loss of her freedom, the life she had built for herself. But she also felt a strange sense of belonging, a connection to this place, to her heritage, that she had never allowed herself to feel before. "I don't know," she said, her voice honest. "I miss my old life. But I also feel like I'm rediscovering a part of myself that I had forgotten." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "It is a difficult thing," he said, "to reconcile the past with the present. To find your place in a world that has been chosen for you." She looked at him, surprised by his words, by the hint of empathy in his voice. She had expected him to be cold, distant, indifferent to her feelings. But he seemed to understand. "You seem to understand," she said, her voice questioning. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I have my own ghosts, Juliana," he said. "My own past that I have had to reconcile." She wanted to ask him about his past, about the ghosts that haunted him, but she didn't dare. She knew that he was a man of secrets, a man who guarded his emotions carefully. She was treading on dangerous ground, and she knew it. I found some old photographs," she said, changing the subject, her voice hesitant. "In one of the drawing rooms. Pictures of my father and my mother. Her mother. A woman she had barely known, a woman who had died when Juliana was just a child. A woman who had been a shadow in her life, a whisper of a memory." Salvatore's expression changed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What was she like?" Juliana asked, her voice filled with a longing she had suppressed for years. He hesitated, as if reluctant to speak of her. "She was beautiful," he said, "and strong. She had a spirit that could not be broken, even by this world." He paused, his gaze fixed on hers. "She would have been proud of you, Juliana," he said, "of the woman you have become." His words were a balm to her soul, a validation she had craved for years. She felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, wiping away the tear. His touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver through her. "Don't cry, Juliana," he said, his voice soft, his eyes holding hers. "You are stronger than you think." She looked at him, at this man who was both her captor and her protector, this man who held her fate in his hands. She saw the darkness in him, the ruthlessness, but she also saw something else, something that drew her to him, something that made her heart beat faster. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden desire, and she knew it. But she couldn't deny it. The echoes of the empty palace seemed to fade as his hand lingered, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. A silent question hung in the air, a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer, a question he wasn't yet ready to ask. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressed down on them, but in that moment, all that mattered was the electric tension that crackled between them, a spark in the darkness. Chapter 5. The Devil's Bargain Unveiled. The following days were marked by a growing unease, a sense of impending doom that hung over the Costa estate like a shroud. Juliana found herself increasingly drawn to Salvatore, despite her better judgment. She sought him out, engaging him in conversations about art, history, anything to distract herself from the reality of their situation. She learned that he was surprisingly knowledgeable about art, particularly the Renaissance masters she loved. He had a keen eye for detail, a deep appreciation for beauty, a side of him that she hadn't expected. He, in turn, seemed fascinated by her world, by the stories she told of museums, exhibitions, and the quiet, scholarly life she had led. But the shadow of their forced alliance always loomed, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their connection. She knew that he was still assessing her, weighing her, trying to determine her loyalty, her usefulness. And she knew that she was playing a dangerous game, allowing herself to be drawn to a man who represented everything she had tried to escape. One afternoon, Salvatore summoned her to his study. He was standing by the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. The room felt colder than usual, the air thick with tension. "Juliana," he said, his voice formal, his tone devoid of any warmth. "We need to talk." She felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew this conversation was coming, the inevitable discussion of their future, of the role she was expected to play in his world. She walked towards him, her steps measured, her head held high.
"About what?"
she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "About the arrangement," he said. "About our marriage." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marriage. A union she had never wanted, a bond that would tie her to him, to this world, forever. "What about it?" she asked, her voice challenging. He walked towards her, his eyes fixed on hers.
"It is time we formalized our alliance," he said. "It is time we became husband and wife."
She felt a surge of anger, of defiance. "And what if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stopped in front of her, his gaze unwavering.
"You know the consequences," he said.
"For you, for your family, for everyone who is loyal to the DeLuca name." She knew. He didn't need to elaborate. Refusal meant war, bloodshed, the destruction of everything her father had built. It meant her own death, or worse, a life of exile, of constant fear. "So, I have no choice," she said, her voice bitter. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver through her. "You always have a choice, Juliana," he said, his voice soft. "But some choices are more difficult than others." She looked at him, at his dark, intense eyes, at the lines of weariness etched on his face. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of his responsibilities, the loneliness of his position. And she saw, for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the man beneath the mask. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did my father choose me for this arrangement?" He hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal the truth. "Your father believed you were strong," he said. "He believed you had the intelligence, the resilience, to handle this world.
He believed you could be an asset."
An asset.
A tool.
A pawn. Was that all she was to him? To her father? "And what do you believe?" she asked, her voice challenging. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. "I believe he was right," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I believe you are more than just an asset, Juliana. I believe you are extraordinary." His words took her by surprise. She had expected him to be cold, calculating, indifferent to her feelings. But he seemed to see her, to understand her, in a way that no one else ever had. "But this marriage," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's not a real marriage, is it? It's just a business arrangement." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "In our world, Juliana," he said, "business and family are often intertwined." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But that doesn't mean it cannot be something more," he continued. "It doesn't mean we cannot find our own way, our own understanding." His words hung in the air, a promise and a threat. He was offering her a choice, a chance to make this arrangement something more than just a forced alliance. But she knew that accepting his offer meant stepping further into his world, a world of danger, of betrayal, of constant uncertainty. The devil's bargain was unveiled, laid bare before her. She could refuse and face the consequences, or she could accept and risk losing herself entirely. She looked into his eyes, searching for an answer, a sign, anything to guide her. All she found was a reflection of her own conflicted heart, a heart torn between duty and desire, between fear and a strange, unsettling hope. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken possibilities, with the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. Chapter 6. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The wedding was a spectacle, a lavish display of power and wealth designed to solidify the alliance between the Costa and DeLuca families. The ceremony took place in a centuries-old church, its soaring ceilings and stained glass windows casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the assembled guests. Juliana walked down the aisle on Marco's arm, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze fixed on the altar where Salvatore waited. She wore a traditional Italian wedding dress, a masterpiece of lace and silk, a family heirloom passed down through generations of DeLuca women. It was a beautiful dress, but it felt like a costume, a symbol of the role she was being forced to play. Salvatore looked breathtakingly handsome in his tailored suit, his dark eyes intense, his expression unreadable. As she reached the altar, he took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His grip was firm, possessive, a silent declaration of ownership. The ceremony was performed in Latin, the ancient words echoing through the church, a solemn vow that bound them together, not in love, but in a pact of mutual survival. Juliana felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance, a spectator in her own life. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Salvatore leaned down and kissed her, his lips surprisingly soft, his touch lingering. It was a brief kiss, a public display of affection, but it sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling desire. The reception was held at the Costa Mansion, a grand affair with hundreds of guests, a mix of family members, business associates, and political figures. Juliana found herself surrounded by unfamiliar faces, by people who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She felt like an outsider, a stranger in this world of power and privilege. Salvatore remained by her side throughout the evening, introducing her to the key players in his world, his hand always on her arm, a constant reminder of his control. He was charming, gracious, the perfect host, but she could sense the underlying tension, the watchful eyes, the unspoken threats that lurked beneath the surface. She met his mother, a formidable woman with steely eyes and a regal bearing, who greeted her with a cool politeness that bordered on disdain. She met his consigliere, a man named Lorenzo, who was even more intimidating than Marco, his gaze sharp and assessing. She met various other members of the Costa family, each one a player in this complex game of power. As the evening wore on, Juliana felt increasingly suffocated, trapped in this cage of gilded promises. She longed for escape, for the quiet solitude of her London flat, for the life she had lost. She found herself standing on the terrace, overlooking the gardens, the city lights twinkling below. She took a deep breath of the night air, trying to calm the turmoil within her. "It's a beautiful view," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly Salvatore was standing beside her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "It is," he replied, his voice low and resonant. "But beauty can be deceiving, Juliana. Just like people." She looked at him, her eyes questioning. "Are you talking about me?" she asked. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Perhaps," he said.
"But I am also talking about myself." She was intrigued by his words, by the hint of vulnerability in his voice. She wanted to know more, to understand the man behind the mask, the man who held her fate in his hands. "Tell me about yourself, Salvatore," she said, her voice soft. "Tell me about the ghosts that haunt you." He hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal his secrets. "My past is not a pretty story, Juliana," he said. "It is filled with violence, betrayal, loss." "I know," she replied. "I've heard the rumors." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Rumors are often exaggerated," he said, "but they also contain a grain of truth." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I was born into this world, Juliana," he continued. "Just like you. I had no choice. My father was a powerful man, a ruthless man. He taught me everything I know. He taught me how to survive, how to rule." "And did you want to rule?" she asked. He shrugged, a gesture of indifference that didn't quite convince her. "It was my duty," he said. "My inheritance. Just like you." She understood. She felt a connection to him, a shared burden of responsibility, a shared fate that had been thrust upon them. "But there must have been something else," she said. "Something you wanted for yourself. Something outside of this world." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. "There was," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it was a dream that could never be." She wanted to ask him about that dream, about the life he had yearned for, but she didn't dare. She knew that she was treading on dangerous ground, that she was getting too close to the heart of the man she was supposed to fear. The cage was beautiful, ornate, filled with everything she could possibly desire except freedom. The promises whispered throughout the night were gilded, shiny, but they held the weight of obligation, of a life she hadn't chosen. As Salvatore turned back to face the party, his hand briefly resting on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that sent a shiver down her spine, she knew the game had truly begun. She was his wife, his queen in title. But the true test, the true struggle for power and perhaps for something more, was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The weeks that followed the wedding were a period of adjustment, of learning the intricate rules of this new, dangerous world. Juliana found herself navigating a treacherous landscape of family politics, rivalries, and unspoken threats. She was constantly under scrutiny, her every move watched, her every word analyzed. She tried to maintain a distance from Salvatore, to keep their relationship formal, professional. But it was becoming increasingly difficult. He was always there, a constant presence in her life, his dark eyes watching her, his touch sending shivers through her. She discovered that he had a private study, a sanctuary where he retreated from the demands of his world. It was a room filled with books, maps, and ancient artifacts, a reflection of his hidden intellectual side. She would often find him there, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration, his expression lost in thought. One evening, she found him standing by the window, gazing out at the city below. He was dressed in a simple white shirt and trousers, his usual formality replaced by a relaxed ease that made him seem even more vulnerable. "Salvatore," she said, her voice hesitant, her presence an intrusion into his private space. He turned, his expression surprised, then softening as he saw her. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and welcoming. "What brings you here?" I was looking for you," she said, her voice unsure. "I wanted to talk." He gestured towards a chair in front of the fireplace.
"Sit down," he said.
She walked towards the chair, her movements deliberate, her heart beating faster. She sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on hers. "What is it you want to talk about?" he asked, his voice gentle. She hesitated, unsure of how to begin. She wanted to ask him about his past, about the scars that she knew he carried beneath the surface. She wanted to understand him, to break through the walls he had built around himself. I want to know more about you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About the real you." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The real me?" he said. "That is a dangerous question, Juliana." "I'm not afraid," she replied, her voice stronger. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Perhaps you should be," he said. He walked towards the fireplace, leaning against the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed on the flames. "My life has not been easy," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I have seen things, done things, that haunt me." He paused, his gaze shifting to hers. "I have lost people I cared about," he continued. "I have made enemies who would gladly see me dead. I have lived in a world of violence and betrayal, where trust is a luxury I cannot afford." She listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain she saw in his eyes. She understood, in a way that no one else could, the burden he carried, the weight of his responsibilities. "But there must have been moments of happiness," she said. "Moments of peace." He smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes. "There were," he said, "fleeting moments. Like a sunrise over the sea. A beautiful piece of music. A shared laugh with a friend." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "And now there is you," he said, his voice soft. His words took her by surprise. She had expected him to be cold, distant, to keep her at arm's length. But he seemed to need her, to find solace in her presence. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice trembling. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a wave of warmth through her. "You don't need to say anything, Juliana," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Just be here." She looked at him, at his dark, intense eyes, at the vulnerability she saw there. She felt a connection to him, a bond that was growing stronger every day. It was a dangerous connection, a forbidden desire, but she could no longer deny it. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a question more than a statement, a test of her willingness. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a kiss that spoke of years of suppressed longing, of hidden desires, of a connection that defied the boundaries of their forced alliance. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. She felt his heart beating against hers, a rhythm that matched her own. She felt safe in his arms, protected, cherished. But even in this moment of intimacy, she knew that the danger was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She knew that she was playing with fire, that she was risking everything by allowing herself to fall for this man, this capo dei capi, this king of the underworld. She pulled back slightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Salvatore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is dangerous." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and regret. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, "but I can't help myself." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration, of a battle waged within himself. The scars, both visible and invisible, were there, etched onto his soul. She saw them, not just as marks of violence, but as testaments to a life lived on the edge, a life she was now inextricably bound to. And in that moment, she made a choice to embrace the danger, to face the unknown, to see where this forbidden path would lead. Chapter 8. The Dance of Deception and Desire. Their relationship shifted, evolving from a forced alliance into something more complex, more intimate, more dangerous. Juliana found herself drawn into Salvatore's world, not as a prisoner, but as a participant, a confidant, a lover. They spent hours together, talking, sharing their thoughts, their dreams, their fears. She learned about his childhood, about the pressures he had faced as the heir to a criminal empire, about the sacrifices he had made. He, in turn, learned about her life in London, about her passion for art, about the freedom she had cherished. They explored the city together, visiting hidden trattorias, ancient ruins, and secluded beaches. He showed her a side of Naples she had never seen before, a city of beauty, of passion, of resilience. She, in turn, showed him a world of art, of history, of ideas, a world beyond the confines of his criminal empire. But their newfound intimacy was always shadowed by the reality of their situation. They were surrounded by enemies, by rivals who would gladly see them both dead. They were living a lie, a deception, their love a secret that had to be hidden from the world. One evening, they were having dinner in a small, secluded restaurant overlooking the Bay of Naples. The air was warm, the sea breeze gentle, the atmosphere romantic. They were talking, laughing, sharing a bottle of wine, their hands touching across the table. "I never thought I could be happy," Salvatore said, his voice low and sincere, his eyes fixed on hers. "Not in this world. Not after everything." "And are you happy?" Juliana asked, her voice hesitant. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "With you, yes," he said. "You have brought light into my life, Juliana. You have shown me that there is something more than just power and violence." His words warmed her heart, but they also filled her with a sense of unease. She knew that their happiness was fragile, that it could be shattered at any moment. "But what about the others?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about your family? Your associates? What will they think of us?" His expression darkened, the shadows returning to his eyes. "They will not understand," he said. "They will see you as a weakness, a threat. And will you let them harm me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Never," he said, his voice fierce. "I will protect you, Juliana. No matter what." His words were a promise, a vow, but she knew that promises could be broken, that vows could be betrayed. She was living in a world of deception, where trust was a dangerous commodity. Later that evening, as they were walking back to the car, they were ambushed. A group of men, armed with knives and guns, emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden by masks. Salvatore reacted instantly, pushing Juliana behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew his own gun, firing at the attackers, his movements swift and precise. The scene was chaotic, a blur of violence and noise. Juliana huddled behind Salvatore, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She could hear the gunshots, the the screams, the sounds of fighting. She saw one of the attackers lunge at Salvatore, a knife glinting in the moonlight. She screamed, a primal cry of fear and desperation. Salvatore turned, firing his gun at the attacker, the man falling to the ground, his body lifeless. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining attackers fled, disappearing into the darkness. Salvatore turned to Juliana, his face pale, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded, her body shaking, her mind reeling from the shock of the attack. He pulled her close, holding her tight, his arms wrapping around her, protecting her. "I told you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I will always protect you." But as she clung to him, she realized that the danger was not just external. The danger was also within. She was falling in love with a man who lived in a world of violence, a man who could be her savior or her destroyer. The dance of deception and desire had reached a fever pitch. The attack, the near miss, the raw fear, it all served to strip away the pretense, leaving only the stark truth of their feelings and the equally stark reality of the world they inhabited. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. Chapter 9. Threads of Fate Unraveling. The attack served as a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Salvatore tightened security around Juliana, assigning her a personal bodyguard, a silent, watchful man named Franco, who followed her everywhere. She felt like a prisoner again, trapped in a gilded cage, but she understood the necessity. Salvatore became more withdrawn, more preoccupied, spending long hours in his study, meeting with his consigliera, Lorenzo, and other members of the family. She sensed that he was planning something, preparing for a confrontation, but he wouldn't tell her what was going on. She tried to distract herself, spending her time reading, exploring the mansion, and sketching in the gardens. But her mind was always racing, filled with worry and fear. She was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, her senses on high alert. One afternoon, she was in the library, searching for a book, when she stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind one of the shelves. She hesitated, her curiosity piqued. She knew she shouldn't pry, but she couldn't resist. She opened the compartment, revealing a small, wooden box. She carefully lifted the box, her hands trembling. She opened it, revealing a collection of old letters, photographs, and documents. She began to read the letters, her heart pounding in her chest. They were written by her mother, addressed to a man she didn't recognize, a man named Antonio. The letters were filled with love, with passion, with a longing for a life that could never be. She realized, with a shock, that her mother had been having an affair, that she had been in love with another man, not her father. The revelation shattered her image of her parents, of the family she thought she knew. She continued to read, her mind reeling. She discovered that Antonio was a rival of her father's, a member of a competing family. Their love was forbidden, a betrayal that could have had deadly consequences. She found a photograph of her mother and Antonio together, their arms wrapped around each other, their faces radiant with happiness. It was a picture of a love that was both beautiful and tragic. She felt a wave of sadness, of grief, for her mother, for the life she had been denied, for the love she had had to hide. She also felt a sense of anger, of betrayal, towards her father, for keeping this secret from her, for controlling her mother's life. She was so engrossed in the letters that she didn't hear Salvatore enter the room. He stood behind her, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Juliana," he said, his voice soft, his tone cautious. She jumped, startled, dropping the letters, scattering them across the floor. She turned to face him, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. "Salvatore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." He walked towards her, his gaze fixed on the letters. He knelt down, picking them up, his hands carefully gathering the scattered pieces of her mother's past. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and questioning. She explained what she had found, her voice choked with emotion. She told him about her mother's affair, about her love for Antonio, about the secret she had kept hidden for so many years. Salvatore listened, his expression unchanged. He didn't judge, he didn't condemn, he just listened. When she had finished, he stood up, his gaze holding hers. "Your mother was a brave woman," he said, his voice thoughtful. "She risked everything for love. But it was a forbidden love," she said, her voice bitter. "A love that could never be." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "In our world, Juliana," he said, "love is often a dangerous thing." He paused, his gaze shifting to the photograph of her mother and Antonio. "But it is also the most powerful thing," he continued. "It can make us do extraordinary things. It can make us defy the rules, challenge the odds, risk everything." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "And sometimes," he said, "it can even redeem us." His words resonated with her, touching a chord deep within her soul. She realized that she was falling in love with Salvatore, that she was risking everything for a love that was just as forbidden, just as dangerous, as her mother's. The threads of fate were unraveling, revealing a past she never knew, a present she couldn't control, and a future that was uncertain. As Salvatore gathered the letters, carefully placing them back in the box, a silent understanding passed between them. The secrets of the past were intertwined with the dangers of the present, and their own forbidden love was a fragile thread, woven into the tapestry of betrayal and loyalty. Where it would lead, neither of them knew. Chapter 10. Shadows of the Past Converge. The discovery of her mother's secret changed everything. Juliana felt a newfound connection to her mother, a sense of understanding that had eluded her for years. She also felt a growing sense of unease, of foreboding. She knew that the past had a way of catching up with the present, that secrets had a way of being revealed, often with devastating consequences. Salvatore became more protective of her, more attentive, as if sensing her vulnerability. He shared more of his own past with her, telling her stories of his childhood, of his relationship with his father, of the events that had shaped him into the man he was. He told her about his first love, a woman named Isabella, who had been killed by a rival family. He had never gotten over her death, and he had vowed to avenge her. He had built his empire on a foundation of revenge, of a desire to crush his enemies and protect those he cared about. Juliana listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the losses he had suffered. She understood his ruthlessness, his coldness, his need for control. It was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from further pain. One evening, Salvatore took her to a secluded villa overlooking the sea. It was a place where he went to escape the pressures of his world, a place where he could be himself, away from the prying eyes of his family and associates. They sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was warm, the sea breeze gentle, the atmosphere peaceful. "This is beautiful," Juliana said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," Salvatore replied, his voice low and resonant. "It reminds me of Isabella." He had never spoken of her so openly before. Juliana felt a pang of jealousy, but she also felt a sense of understanding. She knew that Isabella was a part of him, a part of his past that he could never erase. "Tell me about her," she said, her voice hesitant. He smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile. "She was everything," he said. "She was kind. She was generous. She was full of life. She saw the good in me, even when I didn't see it myself." He paused, his gaze shifting to hers. "She was like you," he said, his voice soft. His words took her by surprise. She had never thought of herself as being like Isabella, as being someone who could inspire such love, such devotion. "But she's gone," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his expression darkening. "And I will never forgive those who took her from me," he said, his voice fierce. She understood his anger, his need for revenge. But she also feared it. She knew that it could consume him, that it could destroy everything he had built, everything they had together. The shadows of the past were converging, threatening to engulf them both. Juliana realized that her mother's story and Isabella's story were not so different. Both women had been caught in a web of forbidden love, of violence and betrayal, and she feared that she was destined to follow the same path. They remained in silence for a long while. "There's something you should know. About my father, about his death," he finally said. The words, heavy with unspoken implications, shattered the quiet tranquility. Juliana turned to him, her heart pounding with a sudden, inexplicable dread. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if gauging her reaction, bracing her for a blow he knew was coming. He took a deep breath. "It wasn't an ambush, Juliana. Not in the way we were told. My father, he arranged it." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Arranged it? Arranged his own death?"
"Why?"
He looked away, towards the darkening horizon, the beautiful sunset now a mocking backdrop to the ugly truth he was revealing. He was tired, Juliana. Tired of the life, the constant threat, the endless cycle of violence. He wanted out, but he knew there was only one way out. "And he used you," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "He used you to stage his own death. To make it look like." She looked at Salvatore and felt a chill, not of the evening air, but of a deeper, more profound coldness. It settled into her soul, this awful knowledge of his past, his present. She was in the very center of a storm.
"He knew," she said.
Salvatore nodded, his silence a chilling confirmation. "And he told you to marry me." It all, with cruel clarity, now made sense. She had believed she was part of a power grab, a new generation solidifying. She looked to the dark sky, to the villa, to the man sitting beside her. It was all a ruse, a trick. "Yes," she said and stood, moving away from him.
Toward the edge.
He stood also. "Juliana," he said, reaching out to her. "I need a moment," she said and walked, slowly to the edge. The threads had indeed unraveled, and the garment they had made, this life, this marriage, was now nothing but a collection of lies, tattered and torn, beyond repair. Chapter 11. A glimmer of hope in darkness. Juliana stood at the edge of the terrace, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the vast expanse of the sea stretching out before her, a mirror of the turmoil within her. Salvatore's revelation had shattered her world, leaving her feeling lost, betrayed, and utterly alone. He approached her cautiously, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with concern. "Juliana," he said, his voice soft, his tone pleading. "Please don't do anything rash." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "Rash?" she said, her voice trembling. "You think I'm going to jump? Is that what you think of me, Salvatore? That I'm so weak, so desperate, that I would end my life?" He shook his head, his expression anguished. "No," he said. "That's not what I meant. I don't want you to get hurt." "Hurt," she said, her voice rising. "I'm already hurt, Salvatore. You've hurt me. Your father hurt me. This whole charade has hurt me." She turned away from him, her gaze fixed on the sea. I thought I was starting to understand this world," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was starting to understand you. But I was wrong. It's all a lie. Everything is a lie." He came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. She resisted at first, but then she leaned back against him, her body trembling. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know it's a lot to process. But I swear to you, Juliana, my feelings for you are real. They're the only thing that is real in this messed up world." She closed her eyes, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him, she wanted to trust him, but she didn't know if she could. He had lied to her, he had manipulated her, he had used her, just like his father had. "How can I trust you, Salvatore?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can I trust anything you say?" He tightened his grip on her, his body pressed against hers. "I know I've made mistakes," he said. "I know I've hurt you, but I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be a better man. For you." She turned in his arms, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the vulnerability. She saw the man he was trying to be, the man he could be, if he could only escape the shadows of his past. "I want to believe you," she said, her voice soft. "I really do. But it's hard." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I know it is," he said. "And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm asking you to give me a chance."
"Give us a chance."
She looked at him, at his dark, intense eyes, at the love she saw there. She felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness that had surrounded her. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be challenges, betrayals, dangers. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Salvatore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll give you a chance." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, his lips soft, his touch gentle. It was a kiss of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of hope. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The sea breeze whispered around them, carrying away the pain, the anger, the betrayal, leaving behind a fragile sense of peace. As they walked back to the villa, hand in hand, Juliana knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. They had a long way to go, many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could make it, that they could build a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. A glimmer, small and fragile, but undeniably there. A spark of light in the overwhelming darkness. But as they approached the villa, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the path before them. Lorenzo. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed. "We have a problem," he said, his voice curt, his gaze fixed on Salvatore. The glimmer of hope flickered, threatened by the ever-present darkness of their world. The fragile peace shattered, replaced by the chilling reality of the life they could never truly escape. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty and Love. Lorenzo's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. Juliana felt a chill run down her spine, the fragile peace of the evening shattered by the intrusion of reality. Salvatore's grip on her hand tightened, his body tensing, his demeanor shifting from lover to capo. "What is it, Lorenzo?" he asked, his voice cold, his eyes narrowed. Lorenzo glanced at Juliana, his expression wary, as if reluctant to speak in front of her. "It's delicate," he said. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Salvatore hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Wait for me in the study," he said to Lorenzo, his voice firm. Lorenzo nodded and disappeared back into the villa, leaving Juliana and Salvatore alone. "What is it?" Juliana asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "What's wrong?" Salvatore turned to her, his expression troubled.
"I don't know," he said.
"But I have a feeling it's not good." He took her hand, leading her back inside the villa. The warmth and beauty of the building seemed to mock them now, a facade hiding the darkness that lurked beneath. They walked in silence to his study, the air thick with tension. Salvatore opened the door, revealing Lorenzo standing by the window, his back to them. "Tell me," Salvatore said, his voice commanding. Lorenzo turned, his face grim. "It's the Moretti family," he said. "They're making a move." The Moretti family, a rival clan, one of the most powerful families in Naples and longtime enemies of the Costas. Juliana felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "What kind of move?" Salvatore asked, his voice sharp. "They've been encroaching on our territory," Lorenzo said. "Taking over our businesses, intimidating our people. They're testing us, Salvatore. They're looking for a weakness." Salvatore's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "And what have you done about it?" he asked. "I've tried to negotiate," Lorenzo said. "But they're not interested in peace. They want war."
"Va."
The word echoed in Juliana's mind, a terrifying prospect. She knew what war meant in their world. Bloodshed, violence, death. "They know about Juliana," Lorenzo continued, his gaze shifting to her. "They know about the arrangement. They see her as a vulnerability." Juliana felt a shiver run down her spine. She was the target, the pawn in this deadly game. Salvatore stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. "They will not touch her," he said, his voice fierce. "I will protect her." "With all due respect, Salvatore," Lorenzo said, "you cannot protect her from everything. They will use her against you. They will try to exploit your feelings for her." Salvatore's expression hardened.
"They will try," he said.
"But they will fail." He turned to Juliana, his eyes softening. "I need you to be strong," he said. "I need you to be careful. They will try to get to you, to use you to get to me. You cannot trust anyone, not even some of our own." His words were a chilling reminder of the danger she was in, of the constant threat that surrounded them. She was caught in a web of loyalty and betrayal, where love was a weapon and trust was a luxury she could not afford. He looked back to Lorenzo, and the two men continued to talk in hushed, intense voices. Juliana listened, understanding little, but feeling the heavy weight of consequence in every word. This was the world she had married into, the world she had tried to escape. A world where love and loyalty were constantly tested, where the price of both could be measured in blood. The price was steep, and she knew, with a growing sense of dread, that someone would have to pay. The question was who, and how much would they be willing to sacrifice? Chapter 13. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The following days were filled with a suffocating tension. Juliana found herself confined to the mansion, her movements restricted, her freedom curtailed. She was under constant surveillance, not just by Franco, her bodyguard, but by the other members of the household staff, their eyes always watching, their whispers following her like shadows. Salvatore was consumed by the escalating conflict with the Moretti family. He spent long hours in meetings, his face grim, his demeanor withdrawn. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was always brief, formal. The intimacy they had shared seemingly vanished. She felt isolated, alone, trapped in a world she didn't understand, a world where she was a pawn in a deadly game. She longed for escape, for the simplicity of her old life, for the freedom she had lost. One afternoon, she was in the gardens, trying to find some solace in the beauty of the flowers, when she saw Marco approaching her. She hadn't seen him since her arrival in Naples, and she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of connection to her past. "Marco," she said, her voice welcoming. "It's good to see you." He smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Signorina De Luca," he said, his voice formal. "Or should I say Signora Costa?" His words were a subtle reminder of her new status, of her allegiance to Salvatore, to the Costa family. "How are you, Marco?" she asked, ignoring his veiled comment. "I am concerned," he said, his expression serious.
"About you."
"About the situation." "The situation?" she asked, her voice questioning. "The Moretti family," he said. "They are dangerous. And they are not afraid to use any means necessary to achieve their goals." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. "Salvatore has told me." Marco looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Salvatore is a good man," he said. "But he is also a powerful man. And power can be a dangerous thing. It can blind you. It can make you make mistakes." She didn't understand what he was getting at. "What are you trying to say, Marco?" she asked. He hesitated, as if reluctant to speak his mind. "I am saying be careful, Signorina," he said. "Trust no one. Not even Salvatore." His words shocked her. She had trusted Marco. She had seen him as a friend, an ally. But now, he was warning her against Salvatore, the man she loved, the man she had married. "Why are you saying this?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Why would you betray him?" He looked away, his expression troubled. "I am not betraying him," he said. "I am protecting you. I am protecting the De Luca legacy." "The De Luca legacy?" she said, her voice rising. "What about my legacy, Marco? What about my life? I am not just a De Luca. I am Juliana." He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "I know," he said, "and I am sorry. But sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." His words chilled her to the bone. She realized, with a growing sense of horror, that Marco was not her friend, not her ally. He was a loyalist, a soldier, willing to do whatever it took to protect the DeLuca family, even if it meant sacrificing her. And it was that moment she noticed the subtle bulge under his jacket.
He was armed. "Marco," she said, and stepped back.
He took a step forward. "Juliana," he said, softly, "I wish there was another way." At that moment, a gunshot rang out, shattering the quiet of the garden. Marco crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, a pool of blood spreading around him. Juliana screamed, her eyes wide with terror. She looked up and saw Salvatore standing on the balcony, a smoking gun in his hand, his face a mask of rage and grief. He had saved her, but at what cost? The betrayal was bitter, the sting of it sharp and agonizing. Marco, a man she had trusted, a man who had been a part of her life since childhood, had been willing to kill her. And Salvatore, the man she loved, had killed him to protect her. The lines between loyalty and treachery, love and violence, were blurred, leaving her lost in a maze of conflicting emotions, of shattered trust and broken bonds. Chapter 14. Masks fall, truths emerge. The aftermath of Marco's death was a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. The mansion was filled with armed men, security tightened to an almost suffocating degree. Juliana was confined to her room, guarded by Franco, her every move watched. Salvatore was a whirlwind of controlled fury, investigating Marco's betrayal, trying to uncover the extent of the conspiracy against them. He questioned the staff, interrogated Marco's known associates, his methods brutal and efficient. Juliana was left alone, isolated, her mind reeling from the shock of what had happened. She couldn't believe that Marco, a man she had trusted, a man who had been like family to her, had been willing to kill her. She couldn't comprehend the depth of his betrayal, the coldness of his loyalty to a legacy that had never truly been hers. She also struggled with Salvatore's actions. She knew he had saved her life, that he had acted to protect her, but the image of him standing on the balcony, the smoking gun in his hand, haunted her. She had seen the darkness in him, the ruthlessness that was a part of his world, a part of him. Several days after the shooting, Salvatore came to her room. He looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and concern. "Juliana," he said, his voice soft, his tone apologetic. "I need to talk to you." She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been avoiding him, avoiding the difficult conversation she knew they needed to have. "About Marco?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his expression grim. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've been investigating," he said, trying to understand why he did it, who he was working with. "And?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if reluctant to reveal the truth.
"It was worse than I thought," he said.
Marco wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy. A conspiracy that goes back years. "What kind of conspiracy?" she asked, her voice filled with dread. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "A conspiracy to control the DeLuca family," he said. "To manipulate your father."
"To use you."
She didn't understand. "Use me?"
she said. "How?"
He took a deep breath, his expression pained. "Your father, he wasn't who you thought he was, Juliana," he said. "He wasn't the strong, independent leader everyone believed him to be.
He was weak. He was controlled."
"Controlled by whom?" she asked, her voice rising. "By a group of powerful men," he said. "Men within the family. Men who wanted to use the DeLuca name, the DeLuca power, for their own purposes." He paused, his gaze fixed on hers. "Marco was one of them," he continued. "He was their inside man. He was manipulating your father for years. And he was planning to do the same to you." Juliana felt a wave of nausea, of disbelief. Her father, the man she had both loved and resented, had been a puppet, a figurehead, controlled by others. And Marco, the man she had trusted, had been one of his manipulators.
"But why?"
she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would they do this?" "Power, Juliana," Salvatore said.
"Greed."
"Control. The same reasons that drive everything in our world." He reached out, taking her hand in his.
His grip was firm, reassuring. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, but I need you to understand. You were never meant to be a queen, Juliana. You were meant to be a pawn. A tool in their game. His words shattered the last remnants of her illusions. She had believed she was returning to Naples to claim her inheritance, to protect her family's legacy. But she had been wrong. She had been lured into a trap, a carefully orchestrated plot to control her, to use her. And you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where do you fit into all of this? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. I was part of it, he said. In the beginning, I was following my father's orders. I was playing the game. But not anymore? She asked, her voice pleading. He shook his head, his expression determined. No, he said. Not anymore. When I met you, everything changed. I saw a different path. A way out of this darkness. He paused, his gaze holding hers. I love you, Juliana, he said, his voice fierce. And I will not let them use you. I will not let them control you. I will protect you. No matter what. The masks had fallen. The truths emerged, revealing a landscape of betrayal and manipulation far more complex than she could have ever imagined. Her father, Marco, the entire foundation of her life, had been built on lies. But in the midst of this devastation, she found a glimmer of hope, a spark of truth in Salvatore's eyes, in his words, in his love. The question was, would it be enough to light their way through the darkness that still surrounded them? Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The revelation of the conspiracy surrounding her father and Marco left Juliana reeling, struggling to reconcile the past with the present, the truth with the lies she had believed for so long. She felt adrift, her sense of identity shattered, her trust broken. Salvatore was her only anchor, her only constant in this storm of uncertainty. He remained by her side, offering her comfort, support, and a fierce determination to protect her from those who would seek to harm her. He shared more details of the conspiracy with her, revealing the names of the key players, the extent of their influence, the depth of their betrayal. He explained how they had manipulated her father, how they had used Marco to control him, and how they had planned to do the same to her. He also told her about his own involvement, about his initial complicity in the plot, and about his eventual decision to break free, to forge his own path, to protect her. He didn't try to excuse his past actions. He didn't try to minimize his guilt. He simply laid bare the truth, trusting her to understand, to forgive. Juliana listened, her heart aching for him, for the burden he had carried, for the choices he had made. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret, the vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. She realized that he was not the cold, ruthless capo she had first believed him to be. He was a complex man, a man shaped by his past, by the violence and betrayal that had surrounded him since childhood. He was a man capable of great cruelty, but also of great love. She found herself drawn to him, not despite his flaws, but because of them. She saw his strength, his resilience, his determination to protect her, to build a better future for them both. She saw the man he was trying to be, the man he could be, if he could only escape the shadows of his past. One evening, they were sitting together in the library, the room filled with the soft glow of candlelight. Salvatore was reading, his brow furrowed in concentration, his expression lost in thought. Juliana was watching him, her heart filled with a mixture of love and longing. Salvatore, she said, her voice soft, her tone hesitant. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Yes, Juliana? He asked, his voice gentle. I want to understand, she said. I want to understand everything. Your world. Your responsibilities. Your choices. He smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile. It's not a pretty world, Juliana, he said. It's not a world I would have chosen for you. But it's your world, she replied. And it's my world now, too. I want to be a part of it. Not as a pawn. Not as a victim. But as your partner. Your equal. His eyes widened, surprised by her words. He had expected her to shy away from his world, to retreat into the safety of her art, of her past.
but she was choosing to embrace it, to face the dangers alongside him. "Are you sure, Juliana?" he asked, his voice questioning. "Are you sure you know what you're asking?" She nodded, her expression determined.
"I'm sure," she said.
"I want to help you. I want to fight alongside you. I want to build a future with you. A future free from lies, from betrayal, from fear." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring.
"It won't be easy," he said.
"There will be challenges. There will be dangers. But together we can face them." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "I love you, Juliana," he said, his voice fierce. "And I will not let anything happen to you. I will protect you. Always." She leaned in, kissing him, her lips soft, her touch gentle. It was a kiss of commitment, of love, of a shared determination to face the future together, whatever it may hold. The heart's reckoning had come, a moment of clarity, of choosing love over fear, of embracing a future fraught with danger, but also filled with the promise of a shared destiny. A future where they would fight, not as capo and queen, but as man and woman, bound by a love that defied the odds, a love that was both their strength and their vulnerability. Chapter 16. Flames of Rebellion Ignite. With Juliana's decision to stand by Salvatore, a new phase began. She was no longer a passive observer, a reluctant participant in this dangerous world. She was an active player, determined to fight alongside him, to protect their future, to dismantle the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy them both. Salvatore began to include her in his meetings, introducing her to his most trusted advisors, sharing information with her, seeking her counsel. She learned the intricate details of his business, the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define the Neapolitan underworld. She discovered that she had a knack for strategy, a keen eye for detail, an ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. She used her knowledge of art and history to decipher coded messages, to identify hidden meanings, to uncover the secrets of their enemies. She also used her charm, her intelligence, her grace, to win over those who were skeptical of her, those who saw her as an outsider, a weakness. She proved to them that she was not just Salvatore's wife, but his partner, his equal, a force to be reckoned with. But their newfound unity also made them a more visible target. The conspirators, led by a shadowy figure known only as Il Maestro, realized that Juliana was not the pawn they had expected her to be. They saw her as a threat, a danger to their plans, and they began to plot against her, against them both. One evening, Salvatore and Juliana were attending a gala, a lavish affair hosted by one of the city's most prominent families. It was a public display of power, of unity, a message to their enemies that they were not afraid, that they would not be intimidated. As they were dancing, Juliana noticed a man watching them, his eyes cold, his expression menacing. She recognized him from one of Salvatore's files, a known assassin, a hired killer working for Il Maestro. She alerted Salvatore, her hand tightening on his arm, her voice barely a whisper.
"He's here," she said.
"The assassin. Il Maestro sent him." Salvatore's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. He scanned the room, his gaze searching for the threat. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low and commanding. They continued to dance, but their movements were now guarded, their senses on high alert. They were surrounded by enemies, by people who would gladly see them dead. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the ballroom into darkness. Chaos erupted, screams filling the air, people scrambling for safety. Salvatore pulled Juliana close, shielding her with his body. "Stay with me," he said, his voice fierce. "Don't let go." They moved through the darkness, trying to find an exit, their hands clasped tightly together. They could hear gunshots, the sounds of fighting, the screams of the injured. They reached a side door, leading to a garden. Salvatore pushed it open, pulling Juliana outside, into the cool night air. But the assassin was waiting for them. He emerged from the shadows, a gun in his hand, his face a mask of cold determination. "It's over, Costa," he said, his voice menacing. "Il Maestro sends his regards." He raised his gun, aiming at Salvatore. Juliana screamed, throwing herself in front of Salvatore, shielding him with her body. But before the assassin could fire, a shot rang out. The assassin crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. Salvatore and Juliana looked up and saw Franco, Salvatore's bodyguard, standing there, a smoking gun in his hand, his face grim. He had saved them. Again. The flames of rebellion had been ignited, not just in their hearts, but in the actions of those loyal to them. It was a turning point, a moment where the tide began to shift, where the hunted became the hunters. But the victory was bittersweet, a reminder of the constant danger they faced, of the price they were willing to pay for their love, for their freedom. Chapter 17. Crossroads of Destiny. The attempted assassination at the gala marked a turning point. It was a clear declaration of war, a sign that Il Maestro and his conspirators were willing to do anything to eliminate Salvatore and Juliana, to regain control of the De Luca and Costa families. Salvatore responded with swift and brutal efficiency. He mobilized his forces, gathering his most trusted allies, preparing for a confrontation that he knew was inevitable. He tightened security around Juliana, restricting her movements even further, fearing for her safety. But Juliana refused to be sidelined. She insisted on being involved, on contributing to the fight, on using her knowledge and skills to help Salvatore defeat their enemies. She spent hours poring over the information they had gathered, analyzing the evidence, searching for clues that might lead them to Il Maestro. She used her network of contacts in the art world, her connections to historians and researchers, to uncover information about the conspirators, about their past, about their weaknesses. She discovered that Il Maestro was not a single person, but a collective, a group of powerful men who had been manipulating the Neapolitan underworld for decades. They were the architects of the conspiracy against her father, the masterminds behind Marco's betrayal, the driving force behind the attacks on Salvatore and her. She also discovered that they had a weakness, a hidden archive, a secret repository of information that contained evidence of their crimes, their betrayals, their manipulations. The archive was located in a heavily guarded villa outside Naples, a fortress that was considered impenetrable. Juliana knew that obtaining the information in the archive was crucial to their survival. It was the key to exposing Il Maestro, to dismantling their power, to ending the threat against them once and for all. She presented her findings to Salvatore, outlining a plan to infiltrate the villa, to retrieve the archive, to use it to bring down their enemies. Salvatore was hesitant. The plan was risky, dangerous, almost suicidal. He didn't want to put Juliana in harm's way, to risk losing her. "It's too dangerous, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with concern. "I can't let you do this." "I'm not asking for your permission, Salvatore," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm telling you what needs to be done. We're in this together. We fight together. We win together. Or we lose together." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and fear. He saw her strength, her determination, her unwavering commitment to him, to their future. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "We'll do it. Together." They spent days planning the operation, gathering intelligence, assembling a team, preparing for every contingency. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that they were facing a powerful and ruthless enemy. But they were determined to succeed, to fight for their love, for their freedom, for their future. They stood at a crossroads of destiny, a point of no return. Their choices, their actions, would determine their fate, would decide whether they would live or die, whether they would triumph or be defeated. The path ahead was fraught with danger, with uncertainty, but they were ready to face it, together, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken. As the final preparations were made, Salvatore pulled Giuliano aside, his eyes filled with a profound tenderness. "If anything happens to me," he said, his voice low and urgent, "promise me you'll keep fighting. Promise me you'll expose them." Giuliana met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the same fierce determination. "And if anything happens to me," she countered, "promise me you'll live. Promise me you'll build a better world, the world we talked about." They held each other, a a silent vow passing between them, a promise forged in love and sealed with the understanding that their destiny was now intertwined, their fates inextricably linked. The crossroads beckoned, and they were ready to face whatever lay ahead, together. Chapter 18. The Unseen Hand Revealed. The infiltration of the villa was a meticulously planned operation, a delicate dance of precision and daring. Juliana and Salvatore, along with Franco and a small team of trusted men, moved under the cover of darkness, their movements silent, their intentions deadly. Juliana used her knowledge of art and architecture to identify weaknesses in the villa's security, exploiting blind spots, bypassing alarms, navigating the labyrinthine corridors. Salvatore and his men provided the muscle, neutralizing guards, securing key locations, ensuring their escape route. They reached the archive, a heavily fortified room hidden deep within the villa. The door was reinforced with steel, protected by multiple locks and electronic security systems. Juliana worked quickly, using her skills to disable the alarms, to pick the locks, to bypass the electronic security. Her fingers flew over the intricate mechanisms, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. After what seemed like an eternity, the door clicked open, revealing the archive, rows upon rows of shelves, filled with files, documents, recordings, a treasure trove of information that held the key to their salvation. They began to gather the evidence, carefully selecting the most incriminating files, the documents that would expose Il Maestro and his conspirators. They worked quickly, efficiently, knowing that time was of the essence. But as they were about to leave, they heard a noise, a warning signal, an alarm. They had been discovered. Salvatore pushed Juliana behind him, shielding her with his body.
Go, he said, his voice urgent.
Get out of here. Take the evidence.
Expose them.
No, she said, her voice defiant. I'm not leaving you. You have to, he said. You're the only one who can finish this. You're the only one who can make it right. He kissed her, a desperate, passionate kiss, a farewell and a promise. Then he pushed her towards the exit, turning to face the oncoming guards, his gun drawn. Juliana hesitated for a moment, her heart torn between her love for Salvatore and her duty to expose the truth. But she knew he was right. She had to escape. She had to survive. She had to finish what they had started. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She could hear the gunshots, the sounds of fighting, the screams of the dying. She didn't look back. She had to keep going. She had to get the evidence to safety. She had to expose Il Maestro. She made it out of the villa, escaping into the darkness, Franco by her side, protecting her, guiding her. They reached their escape vehicle, a nondescript van parked a short distance away. As they were driving away, Juliana looked back at the villa, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know if Salvatore was alive or dead. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she knew that she had to keep fighting, for him, for herself, for their future. And then, as she watched, the villa exploded in a ball of fire, the blast shaking the ground, the flames lighting up the night sky. The unseen hand had struck, attempting to destroy the evidence, to silence them forever. But Juliana had escaped. And she had the evidence. The game was not over. It had just begun. She clutched the satchel containing the files, her knuckles white, her body trembling. The image of Salvatore, pushing her towards safety, his face a mixture of love and determination, was seared into her memory. She had to be strong. She had to be brave. She had to finish what they had started.
For him. For them.
For justice. Chapter 19. Blood and Redemption. Juliana, with Franco's unwavering support, made it back to the Costa mansion, the satchel containing the incriminating evidence clutched tightly in her grasp. The mansion was in lockdown, every entrance guarded, every member of the household staff under suspicion. She went straight to Salvatore's study, locking the door behind her. She spread the documents out on his desk, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She had to analyze the evidence, to identify the key players, to formulate a plan to expose Il Maestro and his conspirators. As she was working, She heard a noise, a soft knock on the door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? Was it one of the conspirators, come to finish what they had started? Juliana. A voice called out, a voice she recognized, a voice that filled her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. It's me.
Salvatore.
She rushed to the door, unlocking it, throwing it open. Salvatore stood there, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face bruised and battered, but alive. She threw herself into his arms, holding him tight, her body shaking with relief. You're alive, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd lost you. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling. I told you, he said, his voice hoarse. I will always protect you. He explained how he had escaped the villa, how he had fought his way out, how he had managed to evade the guards and the explosion. It was a miracle that he was still alive. They turned their attention back to the evidence, working together, their minds focused, their determination renewed. They identified the key members of Il Maestro, the men who had been pulling the strings, controlling the Neapolitan underworld for decades. They discovered that the leader of Il Maestro was none other than Lorenzo, Salvatore's consigliere, the man he had trusted most. The betrayal was deep, cutting to the very core of Salvatore's world. Salvatore was furious, his anger a cold, burning flame. He had been betrayed by his closest advisor, his most trusted friend. He had been blind to the conspiracy that had been unfolding right under his nose. Juliana placed a calming hand on his arm. We have them, Salvatore, she said, her voice firm. We have the evidence. We can expose them. We can end this. They formulated a plan, a strategy to bring down Il Maestro, to expose their crimes, to dismantle their power. They would use the evidence they had gathered to alert the authorities, to leak information to the press, to turn the other families against them. They worked through the night, preparing their attack, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken. They knew that the risks were great, that their enemies were powerful, that they could still fail. But they were determined to fight, to win, to secure their future, to build a better world, free from the shadows of the past. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Salvatore, with Juliana by his side, confronted Lorenzo and the other members of Il Maestro, exposing their crimes, presenting the evidence they had gathered. The other families, seeing the truth, turned against Il Maestro, abandoning them, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. The authorities, alerted by Juliana's anonymous tips, moved in, arresting the conspirators, dismantling their network of power. Lorenzo, cornered and defeated, tried to kill Salvatore, but Juliana intervened, disarming him, saving Salvatore's life once again. In the end, Illinois Maestro was defeated, their reign of terror brought to an end. The Neapolitan underworld was thrown into chaos, but out of the chaos, a new order began to emerge, an order based on justice, on fairness, on a rejection of the old ways of violence and betrayal. Blood had been spilled, sacrifices had been made, but redemption had been achieved. The path was clear, not easy, but clear, for a new beginning, a new life, a new world, forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by love and loyalty. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. With Il Maestro dismantled and its members brought to justice, a fragile peace settled over Naples. The old order was crumbling, replaced by a tentative hope for a future free from the constant threat of violence and betrayal. But the scars of the past remained, etched deep into the hearts and minds of those who had survived. Juliana and Salvatore found themselves at the helm of a new era, tasked with rebuilding the shattered trust, with forging a new path for the Costa and De Luca families. It was a daunting challenge, a responsibility that weighed heavily on them both. They faced opposition from within their own ranks, from those who clung to the old ways, who resented their leadership, who yearned for the return of the ruthless dominance of the past. They also faced skepticism from the outside, from the authorities, from the other families, from a society that had grown accustomed to corruption and violence. But Juliana and Salvatore were determined to succeed. They used their combined strength, their intelligence, their unwavering commitment to each other, to navigate the treacherous landscape of Neapolitan politics, to build alliances, to establish a new code of conduct, to create a future based on justice and fairness. Juliana, drawing on her past, her knowledge of art and history, began to implement social programs, investing in education, in the arts, in the community, creating opportunities for the younger generation, offering them an alternative to a life of crime. Salvatore, using his influence and his reformed network, focused on legitimate businesses, on creating economic opportunities, on fostering a sense of responsibility and accountability within the families. They faced setbacks, challenges, moments of doubt. But they never wavered in their commitment to each other, in their belief in a better future. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from their love, from their shared vision. One evening, they found themselves back at the secluded villa overlooking the sea, the same villa where Salvatore had revealed his father's secret, the same villa where they had faced their greatest fears. They stood on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was warm, the sea breeze gentle, the atmosphere peaceful. "We did it," Juliana said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We actually did it." Salvatore smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We did," he replied, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and relief. "We faced the darkness and we won." He turned to her, his eyes filled with love and admiration. "You saved me, Juliana," he said. "You showed me that there was another way. You gave me hope." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You saved me too, Salvatore," she said. "You gave me a purpose. You gave me a family. You gave me love." They kissed, a long, passionate kiss, a seal on their love, a promise for their future. It was a kiss that spoke of trials overcome, of battles won, of a love that had endured the ultimate test. But even in this moment of peace, of triumph, they knew that the fight was not over. There would always be challenges, there would always be threats, there would always be those who sought to drag them back into the darkness. "What now?" Juliana asked, her voice hesitant, her eyes searching his. Salvatore looked at her, his expression determined. "Now," he said, "we build. We rebuild. We create. We live." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "And we love," he added, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a profound tenderness. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns and violence, but a confrontation of hearts and loyalties. They had chosen love, they had chosen loyalty to each other, and they had emerged victorious. The future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it, together, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had known too much darkness. The past was behind them, the scars would remain, but they were no longer prisoners of their history. They were the architects of their own destiny, the masters of their own fate, ready to build a new world, a better world, a world born from the ashes of the old. Epilogue. 15 years later. The Costa mansion was no longer a fortress, a symbol of power and fear. It was a home, filled with laughter, with children's voices, with the warmth of family. Juliana and Salvatore had built a life together, a life that defied the odds, a life that honored their promise to each other. They had 2 children, Alessandro, named after Juliana's father, a boy with his mother's intelligence and his father's determination, and Isabella, named after Salvatore's first love, a girl with her mother's grace and her father's strength. The Neapolitan underworld had changed. The old families still existed, but their power had diminished, their influence curtailed. Salvatore, with Juliana's guidance, had steered the Costa and De Luca families towards legitimate businesses, towards investments in the community, towards a future free from the constant threat of violence and betrayal. Juliana had established a foundation dedicated to promoting art and education, to providing opportunities for young people, to breaking the cycle of crime and poverty that had plagued Naples for generations. She had become a respected figure in the community, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of change. Salvatore had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the family business, entrusting the leadership to a new generation, a generation that had grown up under their influence, a generation that believed in a different way of doing things. He spent his time mentoring young people, sharing his wisdom, guiding them towards a better future. They often returned to the secluded villa overlooking the sea, the place where their love had been tested, the place where they had made their vows to each other. They would stand on the terrace, watching the sunset, their children playing in the gardens below, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the trials of time. One evening, as they were standing there, Juliana turned to Salvatore, her eyes filled with a love that had only deepened over the years. "We made it," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching for his. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand clasping hers. "We did," he replied. "Against all odds we did." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of loyalty, of shared dreams and hard-won victories. It was a kiss that sealed their legacy, a legacy not of power and fear, but of love and redemption. A legacy that would live on, long after they were gone, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the unwavering strength of love, and the transformative potential of hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sea, a final benediction on their life, their love, their enduring triumph.